7, verses 41 through 54. In the same way, the chief priests, the teachers of the law, and the elders mocked him. "He saved others," they said, "but he cannot save himself. He's the King of Israel. Let him come down now from the cross, and we will believe in him. He trusts in God. Let God rescue him now if he wants him. For he said, 'I am the Son of God.'" In the same way, the rebels who were crucified with him also heaped insults on him. From noon until 3 in the afternoon, darkness came over all the land. About 3 in the afternoon, Jesus cried out with a loud voice, "Eli, Eli, lema sabachthani," which means, my God, why have you forsaken me?" When some of those standing there heard this, they said, "He's calling Elijah." Immediately one of them ran and got a sponge. He filled it with wine vinegar, put it on a staff, and offered it to Jesus to drink. The rest said, "Now leave him alone. Let's see if Elijah comes to save him." And when Jesus had cried out again in a loud voice, he gave up his spirit. At that moment, the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. The earth shook, the rocks split, and the tombs broke open. The bodies of many holy people who had died were raised to life. They came out of the tombs after Jesus' resurrection and went into the holy city and appeared to many people. When the centurion and those with him who were guarding Jesus saw the earthquake and all that had happened, they were terrified and exclaimed, "Surely he was the Son of God." The word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God. Got a handout for you. I'm just going to quickly hand these out to you. Does anyone else need one? All right, no reason to read those handouts yet. We will get to those. But let me just start by saying it's often argued that the Bible is just stories, just myths, just legends. And so I think it would be valuable if there were non-biblical sources stating that Jesus did in fact live. And even more, statements that would corroborate key facts of what the New Testament claims happened. And the question for today is, do we have any of those sources? Especially from those who were neutral or even hostile to Christianity. In other words, people who would have no reason to say anything good about Christ or Christians. And the answer is absolutely, we do. And we're going to, this morning, go through some of those early non-Christian witnesses. And the first person we're going to look at is a man by the name of Flavius Josephus. And he is widely recognized as one of the greatest first-century historians. Just to give you a little bit of background of Josephus, Josephus was born in 37 AD, so just 7 years after Jesus' crucifixion. He was Jewish and came from a family of Jewish priests. and he became a Jewish priest himself. And at the fairly young age of 19, he also became a Pharisee. Well, in 66 AD, the Jews revolted against Roman rule. And the Romans defeated the Jews and eventually destroyed their temple, as many of you know. Josephus then writes two histories. One was a history of the war between the Romans and the Jews, and the other, finished in 93 AD, was a thorough history of the Jews from the beginning to the present, entitled The Antiquities of the Jews. And in the 18th volume of The Antiquities of the Jews, Josephus writes this. He says, "Now there was about this time Jesus, a wise man, if it be lawful to call him a man, for he was a doer of wonderful works, a teacher of such men as receive the truth with pleasure. He drew over to him both many of the Jews and many of the Gentiles. He was the Christ. And when Pilate, at the suggestion of the principal men amongst us, had condemned him to the cross, those that loved him at the first did not forsake him, for he appeared to them alive again the third day, as the divine prophets had foretold these and 10,000 other wonderful things concerning him. And the tribe of Christians, so named from him, are not extinct at this day." Well, according to what we know of Josephus, it does not seem that Josephus was a believer in Jesus being the Messiah, being the Christ, but he's recording what was happening in history. Now, I want to lift up to you a few things that I've heard in my lifetime, sometimes at seminary, sometimes just amongst Christians and non-Christians. But modern-day critics state, as they usually do regarding anything about Jesus, that they think this statement about Jesus was altered at a later date. Now, I want you to understand they have no proof at all of that, but that's how critics try to cast doubt on anything positive regarding Jesus. So what do we know? What we do know is that as early as 320 AD, Eusebius, a church historian, quotes this very statement of Josephus about Jesus. And Eusebius' quotation of what Josephus actually wrote is exactly as what you see here. It's exactly as we see here. And so I want to just slow down, if I'm slowing down. What does Josephus state as being historical? First, that Jesus in fact lived. That he was a real historical person. He was not a myth, he wasn't a legend, he wasn't a good story. That Jesus was a doer of wonderful works. That Jesus was referred to as the Christ. That, and this is very specific, that Pontius Pilate, at the suggestion of the principal men among the Jews, condemned Jesus to death on the cross, crucifixion. And that after being crucified, Jesus' followers did not forsake him, because Jesus appeared to them alive again the third day. and that Jesus fulfilled many Old Testament prophecies about the Messiah, the Christ, which Josephus would have known about as a Jewish priest and Pharisee. And so all this from a non-Christian historian that was published around 93 AD, so just 60 years after Jesus' death and resurrection. And so Josephus corroborates many of the key facts about Jesus Christ. And what Josephus writes fits perfectly with what the writers of the New Testament say. Now, if Josephus' history was all we had, I think that alone would be incredible. I mean, especially since not many copies of ancient works still survive. But you see, Josephus is not the only renowned historian who mentions Jesus. Another is a man by the name of Cornelius Tacitus. Tacitus was a high Roman officer, a Roman senator. But he was also a great historian. In fact, according even to Wikipedia, yeah, I see some heart stopping. He is, and I quote, widely regarded as one of the greatest Roman historians by modern scholars, end quote. Now, I'd like you to keep in mind that today we're looking at people who are neutral or even hostile towards Christianity. And so writing in about 115 AD, so just 85 years after Jesus' crucifixion, Tacitus writes in volume 15, chapter 44 of his work entitled Annals, this statement about the Great Fire of Rome and the Emperor Nero's response. And this is what he writes, this Roman historian and senator. He writes, "But all human efforts, all the lavish gifts of the emperor, and the propitiations of the gods did not banish the sinister belief that the conflagration was the result of an order. Consequently, to get rid of the report, Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations, called Christians by the populace." And this is the part I want you to focus on at the moment. Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilatus. And a most mischievous superstition, thus checked for the moment, again broke out not only in Judea, the first source of the evil, but even in Rome. And so this great Roman historian mentions in his historical writings Christ. And he not only mentions Jesus as an historical person, but he mentions that he suffered the extreme penalty, that is, crucifixion, during the reign of Tiberius, and is very specific again, at the hands of Pontius Pilate. And so again, exactly what the New Testament records regarding Jesus. Here Tacitus also mentions how the, quote, mischievous superstition, end quote. And to me it's clear he's talking about the belief of Jesus' resurrection after the crucifixion. And how that belief first broke out in Judea and had at this very early stage spread even to Rome itself. And so here he records the rapid spread of Christ followers after Jesus' death. And all from the pen of a non-believer, a highly respected historian and well-known figure of his time. Well, I want to share just a little bit more of what Tacitus records about Nero's response to the Great Fire of Rome. And this kind of has to do with what we talked about last week, the martyrdom of the apostles. See, the time Tacitus is writing about is 64 AD. The Great Fire of Rome started on the evening of July 19th, AD 64. And so what Tacitus writes about here leads to the execution of both the Apostle Paul and the Apostle Peter, both of whom were executed in Rome at this time, along with many other Christians. And so the reason I want to read this to you is so what you're going to hear is an early non-Christian historian writing about those very times. Tacitus writes this, and I'm going to start back a little bit from what I've already read, but he said, but all human efforts, all the lavish gifts of the emperor, and the propitiations of the gods did not banish the sinister belief that the conflagration was the result of an order. Consequently, to get rid of the report, Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations. And I just want to insert here, which, by the way, the abominations were essentially that they did not worship the Roman emperor or their other Roman gods. And they thought that was such an abomination. He goes on to say, called Christians by the populace. He says mockery of every sort was added to their deaths. Covered with the skins of beasts, they were torn by dogs and perished, or were nailed to crosses, or were doomed to the flames and burnt to serve as a nightly illumination when daylight had expired. Nero offered his gardens for the spectacle and was exhibiting a show in the circus while he mingled with the people in the dress of a charioteer or stood aloft on a car. And so Tacitus writes, hence, even for criminals who deserved, again, this is a non-Christian, who deserved extreme and exemplary punishment, there arose a feeling of compassion. For it was not as it seemed for the public good, but to glut one man's cruelty, that they were being destroyed. And so that's what this non-Christian Roman senator and historian Tacitus writes about Jesus and Christians, just 85 years after Jesus' crucifixion. Well, what about the accuracy of what is written in the New Testament? Critics might think that much of what is written in the New Testament is exaggerated. And so I'd like for a moment to return to today's scripture passage, if you want to kind of bring that up. And I'd like to start with verse 45. It says, at noon, darkness fell across the whole land until 3 o'clock. At about 3 o'clock, Jesus called out with a loud voice, Eli, Eli, lima sabachthani, which means, my God, why have you abandoned me? And then if you go down to verse 50, then Jesus shouted out again, and he released his spirit. At that moment, the curtain in the sanctuary of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. The earth shook, rocks split apart, and tombs opened. And then go down to verse 54. The Roman officer and the other soldiers at the crucifixion were terrified by the earthquake and all that had happened. They said this man truly was the Son of God. And the question is, did this really happen? Did it happen like this? Or is this just an exaggerated writing style by the disciples? Well, that's what the critics say. It's all hoopla that was written later. Possibly the earliest non-Christian writer to refer to Jesus is a man named Thallus, who was a Greek historian. In about 52 AD, so just 22 years after Jesus' crucifixion, he wrote a 3-volume history of the Mediterranean world. Now, the originals have been lost to time, but in 221 AD, the following quote, referring to Thallus' writings, is made by a Christian historian by the name of Julius Africanus. And Africanus writes this. He says, on the whole world, there pressed a most fearful darkness. And the rocks were rent by an earthquake. In many places in Judea and other districts were thrown down. This darkness, Thallus, in the 3rd book of his history, calls, as appears to me without reason, an eclipse of the sun. And he goes on to say, and I'll explain this in a moment, for the Hebrews celebrate the Passover on the 14th day according to the moon. And the passion of our Savior falls on the day before the Passover. And so Africanus mentions that Thallus, a non-Christian Greek historian, mentions in his history the darkness. And so Thallus doesn't deny that the darkness occurred. Rather, he tries to explain the occurrence of the darkness at that time as being an eclipse of the sun, not something supernatural. But you see here, Africanus shows that Thallus' naturalistic explanation is impossible. For the Passover is celebrated at the full moon. And Christ was crucified at Passover time. And thus it is impossible for a solar eclipse to have occurred, because the moon would be on the wrong side of the earth. You see, during the Passover, the moon would not in any way be in a position to block the sun from our view. But again, what's so interesting here is that Thallus doesn't argue that the darkness during Christ's crucifixion didn't happen. In fact, he mentions this darkness in the 3rd book of his history. Instead, he tries to explain in a naturalistic way, unfortunately for him, in a way that's actually impossible. And it wasn't just him. The same thing is true of another historian, writing in the 100s AD by the name of Phlegon, who also mentions this darkness and the earthquakes that occurred at this time, stating that it became like night in the 6th hour of the day, that is, noon. In writing about the Olympiads, Phlegon gives us a date of these events, of the earthquakes, of the darkness, saying that they happened during the 202nd Olympiad. The 202nd Olympiad ran from 29 AD to 33 AD. So in the very time in which Jesus was crucified. So he actually sets the date when it happened. And it fits at Jesus' crucifixion. And so these non-Christian historians state clearly that the darkness actually occurred, and the earthquakes. And so again, the New Testament writers are not exaggerating at all, but rather are simply recording what happened at that time in history, including the darkness, including the earthquakes. Well, there are other non-Christian witnesses, but I'm just going to touch on one more. The satirist and historian Lucian of Samosata. And Lucian was a Syrian, so there's Syria, Galilee, there's Israel, the northern part Galilee, above that to the north is Syria. So he was a Syrian, and he lived in the 100s AD. Because critics argue that because Lucian was a satirist, in other words, he poked fun at politics, that everything he writes must have been a joke. I mean, I hope I never tell a joke, otherwise everyone's going to think everything I say is a joke. But that's what they say, and there's good reason the critics say it, because they don't want you to understand what Lucian is saying here. And so because they say this, let me first start with what Lucian himself writes about his own passion for history and truth. Lucian writes, history abhors the intrusion of any least scruple of falsehood. He says it's like the windpipe, which the doctors tell us will not tolerate a morsel of stray food. Lucian also writes, the historian's one task is to tell the thing as it happened. And so I just want to warn you, because I've talked with many critics, don't let anyone tell you, as I've heard critics say time and time again, that the historians of old didn't care about accuracy and truth, like the modern historian. That's ironic, huh? But you see, here in his own words, this historian says that the historian's one task, all he has to do is one task, is to tell the thing as it happened. And so in his book, The Death of Peregrine, written about 170 AD, it's only about 140 years after Jesus' crucifixion, Lucian writes this. He says, the Christians worship a man to this day, the distinguished personage who introduced their novel rites and was crucified on that account. It was impressed on them by their original lawgiver that they are all brothers. From the moment that they are converted and deny the gods of Greece and worship the crucified sage and live after his laws. So here again, Jesus is not only mentioned as being a real historical person, but also the fact that he was crucified and worshipped. Lucian records that Jesus is worshipped, he says, to this day. That day being in 170 AD. And his words to this day means that Jesus was worshipped much earlier than that. And so I'll end by quoting the last paragraph of today's passage, because I think it's telling. It says, the Roman officer and the other soldiers at the crucifixion were terrified by the earthquake. And all that happened. They said this man truly was the Son of God. And so I want us all who are sitting here or watching online to understand that in addition to the Bible, what we have here is non-Christian histories that show us that those Roman officers beneath that cross were right. That Jesus truly is the Son of God. Amen.